Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation to this workshop. Just to explain a little bit from where I'm approaching, I'm working as an oncologist at the National Center of Tumor Disease, but only half of my time, and the other time I'm heading a research group on ethics or ethical issues. I will report on the ethical questions that arise at this intersection between research and clinical care. So this is the perspective I'm approaching it, and in my talk I want to give first reasons why the new era of omics research triggers new ethical questions. One could also argue and say nothing is new in ethics, so what are the new ethical aspects or questions? Address the main areas of ethical debate without going into too much detail. I leave that up to you for the discussion part to pick the area that you are most interested in, and then present first answers for best practice guidance. Some of them draw on a platform and project that I will introduce called EURAT, Ethical and Legal Aspects of Whole Genome Sequencing. To start with personalized medicine, I think it's good to go back to the first ideas, how it was portrayed. And it is now more recently called precision medicine. It also has been called or renamed systems medicine. But the original idea is to have all the relevant resources of information organized around each individual patient. And therefore, the National Research Council in the US chose this analogy of Google Maps. Since we had Google in the introduction, but it was Google Maps as an illustration how we could think about navigating an individual patient's treatment by all the relevant data points and biomarkers, be it for prevention or treatment of disease. So I don't know whether it comes up at the back, but compared to Google, who kind of combines the different layers of information by good reasons, it was thought to combine all the different layers that might have an impact for the origin of disease, but also treatment from an individual patient, be it his exposome, so his phenotype, signs and symptoms, what is the clinical world, genome, epigenome, we have heard that today, but also the microbiome, we learn that a lot more in recent months, but also individual patients' behavior and data points, and combine them so to project and determine what this patient will be in a month from now or in years from now with this and that treatment. So it's a very, very ambitious analogy. And if we look at this different layers of information, it becomes clear that the data have their origin in quite different worlds. They originate from the research world and from the clinical world, and more also from the patient's daily world, say it's tracking and health apps that we use. And this is, I think, new, ethically speaking, not the fact that data of different resources are combined. Researchers have already have always combined clinical symptoms and research data, but the approach to integrate data from these different worlds, or two worlds at least, in a very structured and systematic way, and to apply means of system biology to compute and to analyze these data. And this is important from the points of ethics, because if we look at our frameworks of ethics, the different world of care and research are governed by quite different frameworks and with different principles. For example, by the doctor pledged to keep his patient's data confidential and not to share them, and they don't leave any information, does not leave the patient-doctor room, researchers are urged to share their data and make them transparent to the research community. It adds to the quality of their research and for other researchers to build on these data. So transparency is an asset. doctors are liable to good clinical practice, while researchers are responsible for their good scientific practice. So far, they are not responsible for patients, nor for reporting findings out of their research back to patients or their doctors, or the outcome, or for changing the outcome of, for example, genomic diagnostics. So I think it is at this overlap of the two worlds where the most ethical questions arise. And if we look at the debate of the last 50 years to say, we can distinguish at least 4 main areas of debate. First is the handling of incidental findings originating from the research context. The second is genetic data sharing and the inherent risk of re-identification, so the whole privacy issues that come up with it, but not only for genetic data, also for other very personal data. And it all has to be communicated with the patients. We heard that patient participation should enter a new age, so how to inform and let patients participate in decision making. These, I think, the classical domains of research ethics, and just new in their way how to address them. A fourth domain that I will only touch on is more of epistemological nature, namely how we can prove that personalized medicine is the better medicine. What kind of evidence do we need to show benefits in personalized medicine? And this is the same tools of evidence-based medicine that we have developed so far. So my group is working on many of these topics, and what I'm reporting today as potential practice solution is not my work, and it's mainly also work of a group in EURAT that kind of gathered and came together in 2010 when the next generation sequencing came more and more widespread, mainly in the research area. It's the EURAT group and platform called EURAT stands for Ethical and Legal Aspects of Next Generation Sequencing, and this project brings together scholars from the life sciences. You see them more on the left side, so from the DKFZ, next generation sequencing research, genomics, human genetics, and pathology, together with scholars from the normative science, which is ethics, but also law. And we came up with kind of reports or position on policy statements in 2013 and 2016 published, and this is kind of ongoing work, so-called cornerstones for an ethically and legally informed practice of whole genome sequencing. And this is not only kind of a theoretical position statement, it also encompasses very practical solutions, such as consent templates, how to communicate with the patient, and the code of conduct. They are all on the website, and they are also there in English, so I put that with on if you are interested. And in what will follow now, I will touch on these 4 areas on debate and sketch kind of the problem and maybe also first answers. First area that we discussed and started discussing in 2010 was that with whole genome sequencing becoming more and more widespread in the research arena and approaching the clinical world, everybody expected that we find a lot more incidental findings if you look at the whole genome and you're interested in cancer, for example, you not only find driver mutation, whether they exist or not, in cancer, but you find maybe also a susceptibility for, here the example would be diabetes. And many of those incidental findings or additional findings that you were not looking for might have clinical utility. So it was expected for the patient, at least if they were would point to treatable or preventable disease. That's the category right at the top, such as hereditary breast cancer. The Angelina Jolie example is the one that comes to mind first. But it also can point to diseases that are untreatable yet. neurodegenerative diseases, muscle diseases like Huntington gene, for example, or other diseases that don't affect the person himself or herself, but their offspring, like mucoviscidosis. And the results can indicate different penetrance, could be high, medium, or low. So the question was, one of the first questions in the field was how should those incidental findings be handled? Should they be returned even though they are generated not in a diagnostic setting? It's not a patient or a family coming to the doctor and saying, our child is not developing, what is the reason? It's just research participants who spent their tissue for biobanking, for example. So should we transgress this border of research to the clinical world, or should research stay in the research field? And who, in the end, if we want to return those findings, who decides about what to return? What is really of utility? And how can this be done without, with still respecting the right not to know, which has been established, especially if we look in medicine, in human genetics, to protect people from knowledge that they cannot act upon and that might be frightened for them, and they don't want to hear without being asked before. So I summarize more than I discuss the different arguments where the discussion is going at the moment. And I think as to the first question, should results be returned, it's fair to say that the ethical debate in the last years clearly shows a trend towards a yes. If the results have a high penetrance and pathogeneity, and if they are validated. So if they come from the research setting, they first need to be validated in a certified lab before they are channeled back towards the patients. A much more debate is about a second question, namely on who decides what results should be returned. The disclosure positions range from leaving the decision to the expert, up to the professional discretion, to incorporating patient judgment about what is meaningful to them. And those views depart quite a bit. If there was an interesting survey among nearly 7,000 health professionals, genomic researchers, and the public from 75 countries, and they got this question and the following categories. You see here the answers of geneticists in red as compared to those of the public in blue, non-genetic health professionals in green, and genomic researchers in purple. And the different categories, I just read them because they're quite small here. First is life-threatening, can be prevented. There, almost everybody kind of there's some consensus that you would be interested in that. Then carrier status, pharmacogenomics, so on medication, then information that could be useful later in life, for example, whether you have a tendency to become early short-sighted. Ancestry information, that would be this column here. Then life-threatening cannot be prevented, not serious health importance, and uncertain. And you see that is quite a difference how interesting the group that is most reluctant in learning about information about your genome are the genetic health professionals. These are the red ones. The others, more or less, are on the same level interested, still interested in things that might, to 80% useful later in life, or life-threatening, cannot be prevented. It's still up over 50%. And this is an interesting observation because those professionals that would consult us, whether to learn something or not, are those who are most reluctant in conveying this information. And the reason for that, we can discuss this later, might be that they are specifically paternalistic, saying I know what you should learn about or not, or that they have just a lot of experience in how persons react to prognostic information and are therefore more reluctant. I guess just in other medical fields where value-laden questions need to be made, we can here also observe a trend toward shared decision-making, which integrates professional expertise and patient values. Most important, every program, I think, that sequences or deals with genomic information should make it very clear upfront what their disclosure policy is. And the no disclosure policies become more and more rare. EURAT, so our project, suggested a kind of advanced directive solution or a best practice way about disclosure preferences. We introduced in the patient consent process and an explanation, kind of two packages that we would return to patients. The first obvious package would be targeted treatment options or preventive measures exist, and ask the patient whether, if some incidental findings would indicate a lesion that could be treated or prevented, whether they want to learn about it, and the patient can say what kind of person he is, whether he would want that, yes or no, I don't want to learn about these findings. And then there is a second question and discussion about treatment options or where no targeted mutations where no targeted treatment option and preventive measures exist. So that is introduced in the information up front, although there is not much detail then to the specific incidental finding that might come up in the future, because you don't know what you will find if you look quite broadly. So this is, I guess, a way to not solve the dilemma, but kind of give at least information and get a sense what kind of information this person wants to learn later in life. This was the first area of debate. The second field of debate is data sharing and the risk of re-identification. Sharing sequencing data sets has become a common practice in genomics to make the best scientific use of the data and to generate sample sizes that allow for finding patterns and variations. The genomic data are shared obviously in a de-identified and coded way. However, our genetic information is unique, and it is in principle possible to re-identify patients in omics studies. This has been not only theoretically discussed, but also practically shown by a group of around Jacques Ehrlich from the MIT, who write in their landmark publication that they show that a combination of surname with other types of metadata, such as age and state, can be used to triangulate the identity of the target, even if the data have been introduced in the biobanks and the studies de-identified or coded in a coded way. Using this strategy, the team was also able to confirm the identity of anonymous research subjects, including 5 men who participated in both the 1000 Genome Project and some of their family members. That is him. He and his co-authors are kind of a white hacker group, also showed the limitations of emerging computational techniques like encrypting for ensuring genetic privacy. So I think with this kind of limitation to the de-identification, it's just important that this argument of you can spend your data, but we try our best to de-identify it, needs to be addressed and with the patients. So we asked our patients and wanted to know what patients think about sharing of their genomic data. We did a systematic review of the literature and a focus group study with patients from our center, our cancer patients. In the literature, patients and public privacy concerns is an issue. when it comes to genomic data. However, patients in our group had a special interest on information on the risk of re-identification, and it was also, and they were also able to do an adequate risk-benefit assessment. So it was not too difficult to explain that to patients. My genomic data can't be definitely de-identified, and they were able to weigh the benefits of research against risk of triangulation of data and abuse of data, and most of the time weighed the benefits higher than the risks. Provided that institutional safeguards for risk treatment are in place, for example, policies against misuse, data access committees, and up-to-date encryption technology. So in the EURAT project, we argue that the following approach should be combined. First, we explicitly address the risk of re-identification in the patient information and make patients aware not to put their name and even a short sequence in the internet, like this has been done in many of the persons detected by the early study who did ancestry research, basically. And we set up a comprehensive data protection concept for genomic data for the institution in Heidelberg and their collaborators, basically also raising the awareness for this issue through a code of conduct. And here I think it's important to see that it would not be sufficient to stop at point one, just to inform the patient about the new risk and leave it to the patient to join the study or not. But we need, when it comes to data, kind of a conflict between data privacy and utility, we need solutions that address the individual and explain it very well to the patient, but we also need solutions on the governance level. So for example, such as a code of conduct or anti-discrimination laws. And this this law would be law, but a code of conduct is an institutional answer to specific ethical challenges, so could be called soft law also, below jurisdiction, and that can be a first step for institutions to go, to make sure that their researchers are sensitized for data privacy risk and handle that very carefully. So the EURAT Code of Conduct covers the issue of consent, whether the patient consented to data sharing, risk assessment of the use of genomic data, a framework for protecting genomic data, and the ethical issue of return of results and a process of how to channel them back to the treating physician. The conduct has been is binding and has been approved by the medical faculty of the University of Heidelberg, University itself, and the German Cancer Research Center. You might say, well, code of conduct it's kind of patients written on paper, but the way to go to settle on common regulatory issues, I think, is the first important step. Whether it's needed to get that into law and regulation that is less specific to the individual institution, that would be to be decided on a case-by-case and country-by-country base. Just want to show you that other institutions or other platforms, for example, the Global Alliance for Genomic and Health, which is a framework, which is a policy framing organization with more than 500 research and healthcare institutions from 71 countries, also goes for a framework or code of conduct for responsible sharing of genomic and health-related data, trying to set the stage how to interact for global data sharing. And although the slippery slope argument, if your data are out there, you never know, has some kind of alarming point to it. I think with slippery slope arguments, it's always, they can easily be tested whether there is a slippery slope or not. So do we set up a regulatory framework that prevents our genome data that we spend for research institutions to appear in the internet, or is this not successful? So that is an endeavor to make this successful. The framework is built on 4 foundational principles, but there are also core elements for responsible data sharing, such as, for example, that is more concrete and can be also looked up at their website, very concrete policies about accountability, for example, monitoring and responding to non-compliance with data sharing standards. And this goes both ways, data sharing standards in the sense of protection, but also data sharing standards in the sense of do I really share my data, or do I just take the data protection as a kind of window dressing argument for not sharing the data that others request from me. So that is helpful. It is translated in, I think, now 17 different languages. These were the first 9, and is policy that can be looked up and see whether it's helpful for your institution to set up. Don't reinvent the wheel. So in general, to kind of summarize this ethical debate about data sharing, I think we have to think in new ways to deal with the tension between patients and research interests that do not only rely on the traditional concepts of data protection and consent, but rather on the governance of research institutions that justifies trust on the one hand and empowerment ideas to support patient autonomy on the other hand. This means on the patient side more emphasis on trustworthy handling of data and the responsibility of each researcher who works with patient data, but it also means to explore new ways of consenting patients, not only a broad consent, but maybe dynamic consent ideas where the patient is recontacted or can look up at websites what kind of research projects are filled with my data and what is the outcome. And most importantly, maybe an honest communication about the expectations we can have towards personalized medicine. And this is kind of the next issue that we had touched on in several of the talks before, expectation management, I called it. So what does a patient expect from us when he enters the doctor's office from all what he heard and learned about personalized medicine so far? And patients are expecting a truly personal and better treatment. So they want to be treated as a person, and they want to get something special that it's tailored to their own disease and situation. And we can't deliver that in that way so far. So the way that personalized medicine is practiced up to today, it's not so much different than the practice of medicine has always been, that doctors need to treat each patient individually. New are the advances in genomics that allow for a stratification of patients into treatment groups according to molecular biomarkers. But so far, we don't offer the patient any very specific tailored medicine, and that is what the whole wording of personalized medicine promises to the patient. So that is, I think, morally worthy for critique, because we disappoint the patients in what science explained and promised to the patient. If we look what the real benefit of personalized in the sense of biomarker stratified treatment is so far, there are not many benefit measures that could tell us and answer this question, but at least there was one quite recent study who tried to summarize how many patients are really eligible for genome-informed treatment and how many patients benefit from that. It's all, again, in the cancer setting, metastatic cancer patients. And they did a kind of study of all the FDA-approved 38, I think, where genome-informed treatment studies and aggregated the information from all these studies and found out that genome-informed treatment was available for 15% of cancer patients. And the estimated benefit of genome-informed treatment was 66.6 per year for patients with metastatic cancer in the year 2018. And they started their analysis, this group around Marquardt started their analysis in 2006, where it was only 1.3, so it increased over the years. And those the patients that benefited, if kind of to the degree of benefit, it's also interesting to see their median overall response rate for all genome-informed drugs from 2006 to 2018 was a little bit over 50%. And the median duration of response was around 30 months in cancer patients, which sounds quite well in chemo. At least chemotherapy, you have a similar response rate in the first-line treatment, oftentimes around 50, 60%, but oftentimes in many cancers not such a long response rate, but it might seem moderate to you if you expected that this is now a very, very, very effective treatment. So for the issue of expectation management, I think there are at least two answers to go about this. First, the wording personalized medicine is misleading. We have heard that today from several speakers. It would be more honest to call what we do biomarker stratified treatment and prevention and not personalized medicine. In fact, the wording has been kind of corrected by the report 2013 already by the National Research Council. They call it precision medicine, and they really name it in correction to prevent patients from thinking that they get tailored medicine. So precision medicine is already a term to correct the misleading part of the personalized medicine. Precision medicine, again, sounds a little bit very technical, only tailored to the molecules. So if we stay with truly personalized medicine, we could also think about taking that what a patient really expects to be treated as a person into the definition, and then it would be precision medicine plus patient-doctor communication and empowerment, something that is even more ambitious. The second conclusion is the one that the authors of the study themselves draw. They say, well, that's really only a moderate progress in precision oncology, and to accelerate progress, we need novel trial designs of genomic therapies. They should be developed, and broad portfolios of drug development that should also include immunotherapeutic and cytotoxic, again, chemotherapy approaches, and they should be tested against each other. And here we arrive at the fourth area of debate that is not so much research ethics, it's more about the epistemological basis of what knowledge means in this field, because we have arrived over years now at this paradigm of evidence-based medicine, which needs a phase 1 to 3 trial to generate robust knowledge, and then bring it into routine care. So phase 3 randomized trial is kind of the gold standard for approval, and then bring it into routine care, and only fast track for rare diseases get prior approval, and then have a phase 4 post-approval study to see whether the expectations that the FDA had are really fulfilled. With personalized medicine, if you remember the first picture, the whole idea was to bring all the important information from one patient together and integrated, and that's real-world data. And the question is how that can be still, whether the gold standard of randomized phase 3 trials can still be upheld, or should even, should be something else should be put at the level of the evidence approval that we needed so far. And I think here's a really interesting and vivid debate, because you have all different answers from kind of traditional, yes, of course, randomized controlled trials will continue to be the strongest arbiter for the clinical utility of genomic technologies. We can't do without. And of one trials just tell you about this only this one person, to those who say, well, it would be nice, but it's just not feasible. We heard this position today, because the subgroups become ever more heterogeneous and smaller, and we can't try drug combination. That's all getting too expensive, and we just don't arrive at this at such a number of trials. And we need adaptive trials designs, but they come with their own challenges. And then still stronger opponents to old standards argue that it's not necessary to have group level evidence. If there is a convincing rationale for an actionable mechanistic rationale that explains why a certain approach will be successful, that is enough, even more if there are real-world data that show that there's at least one similar patient case that was treated successfully. So if we look here at the data or the studies and evidence that we have, it's interesting that so far there has been only one randomized controlled trial that tried to really compare the approach of genome-informed treatment versus standard treatment. And it has been much criticized, but I still put it up on the slide. It's called the study is called the Shiva study. They had only a limited number, 11 actionable targets, so to say, and looked and randomized the patient groups into targeted or genome-informed treatment of the patients, but within this limited number of 11 different treatments versus treatment as usual, to say oncology, physician's best choice, and guideline-based treatment. And in this trial, they could not show a benefit in progression-free survival was the endpoint for the targeted approach. Also, it was not negative, but they were even. But it was interesting that the group with targeted therapy had a much higher rate of grade 3 and 4 toxicity and lower quality of life than the group of physician's best choice. So that was not kind of a convincing argument for biomarker stratified medicine, but in its upmake also criticized trial, the only trial that I know of that has put those different approaches against each other and tested that. That might be, in a much larger scale, the best way to show its benefit. Meanwhile, what is done, and many cancer centers, the so-called case-by-case decision-making in molecular tumor boards, and then a retrospective kind of analysis to compare these cases that has been discussed there and treated to met in a way of matched pair analysis. And here, in these retrospective studies, which are difficult always also to see and to judge whether this is really an effect of the treatment, there was a large, the program of the MD Anderson showing that almost half of the patients had actionable mutations, and out of those, 143 were treated, and their overall survival was a little bit better than the overall survival of the other patients who had no mutations. But that is in a way difficult to say whether this is really the benefit of the targeted treatment. In our center, we also discuss this a lot. We have a very active program on individual patient consulting and tumor exome testing at our centers. As of May 2018, 1,877 patients were enrolled, and 1,212 patient samples could actually be sequenced. About 1,000 patients had been discussed in the molecular tumor board with treatment recommendations given in 43 cases, so that makes for 82% of those who has been discussed. And in the end, 33% have received medication based on these recommendations. And now it's difficult to say whether how really they benefited, and does this molecular stratification make sense and bring benefit to patients. So looking at overall survival is challenging because they all had different tumors and treatment sequences. So what our group at our center did, they compared the overall response rate and disease control rate of the patients under molecular treatment compared to the chemotherapy they got before, the line before, and saw that there is an increase from 78 to 17% in overall response rate under targeted treatment, and also the disease control rate was 10% more than under conventional treatment. So you see there are different approaches to pin down the benefit of targeted treatment. Due to time, I skipped this one and summarize the main areas of debate and first answers. I first discussed the potential risk of or chance of incidental finding, and that I think a way to go about is to have return packages or advanced information policies to inform the patient what kind of information he or she would interested and what would be offered and how that would be returned to the patient. But then you also need a return process implemented and in place. The potential risk of re-identification need to be adequately communicated with the patient during the informed consent process, but that is not enough. You need also have a governance answer of your institution to minimize risk of data misuse. All this need to be communicated with the patient in the informed consent process, and I think there's a lot to do to improve that, not only the templates of informed consent, but also the models, to use our IT technology also to better inform our patients, and not in one point in time, but over time. And I think the most challenging part is how to, in the end, get the stratified treatment into practice and test all the possibilities. So to accelerate progress on the one hand, but don't open the door for any direct-to-consumer test that should inform now whether a patient gets chemotherapy or no chemotherapy. That is not really validated. So we need quality criteria for precision medicine treatment applications in the end. With that, I come to an end, and thank you for your attention.
Left for questions, if there are any from the audience. Yes. Okay, we'll start with it, then move along. Or the guest first. Okay. What about? You put it out first. Okay. No,
so one question I had addressed the report and the protection specifically concerning what one's obligations are to communicate results that suggest untreatable disease. A sort of mirror image of that is, I wonder whether there was any discussion of what to do about results wondered whether it was discussed. What does one do if the results of the genome data don't no disease, but it suggests that you'd be a good candidate for performance enhancement X, and then what's the obligation there?
I think it was the first focus was on the disease model, but we have this discussion and that is kind of discussed under the rubric of personal utility. So what kind of information can I access that are just for curiosity or motivational to change my behavior, or for improvement? And I think here we still see a kind of a divide between the disease concept and enhancement concept, although I see that there's at certain points overlap. I think in the clinical world, you would say, as a doctor, and I think the ESCO, there's an ESCO recommendation what kind of genome testing should be ordered by oncologists, and also how patients should be informed if they come to you and you didn't even order it but need to explain it. And they have an own rubric under personal curiosity or personal utility, and say, well, you don't order that, and you shouldn't order that, but we would first need some more research into how patients, or not even patients, just the people act upon personal utility testing. Yeah. But it was not in the focus, it was more in the background. Yes, but it depends on what you mean by open consent. So I think, oh, I thought I have a microphone here. Ah, okay.
And I really think this is an extremely important component. And in a sense, if you don't allow that, you should probably not allow people to use Facebook either.
To what? To use? I didn't hear that.
I would say if you don't allow that, you also should not allow people to use Facebook, because
either.
That's probably much more dangerous.
I think they have maybe more personal. So should I answer the question? So I don't know whether the comparison with Facebook is so helpful, because there the persons have a direct utility which they don't have if they spend their tumor tissue to some research projects. No, we discussed open consent. What we have is a broad consent with restricted access and restricted to researchers. And I think most of the international genome collaboration projects, they left open consent and went to at least some restriction. You need to authenticate, so it's true for ECGC, it's true for the Global Alliance. Due to also the Jan F. Ehrlich results, to put it just in open databases makes it more accessible for anyone. And that kind of, it seems that restricted access where you still need to authenticate that you are researchers and not just somebody who is looking into other people's genome for other curiosity reasons is a good way of balancing utility and privacy. I think I would say most of the projects left open consent, and and went to not a very restricted, but some restrictions to access genomes, which does not mean that the patient is not open to support research and say, you can do whatever you want with my data. I just want that those who do something with the data need to authenticate as researchers. So that was our discussion.
So I repeat my question concerning open. If the wrong people get led into a researcher is an agent of information, and so I don't think it is so easy. But my question was actually a different one. I found very interesting your statistics of the people who.
I hear you.
Well, the question of return, the return of information to the patient, and the attitude of the geneticists, of the genetic advisors, I think. So what kind of information do they have more than the others that makes them more reluctant of returning information?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think I can't. There's no study or qualitative study on geneticists how they view it that would give us more information, what their reasons are behind how they answered this quantitative survey. But I think one reason might be their experience, how they in their professional life experience how people deal with preventive or prognostic information, and that they are therefore more reluctant. We had the chair of our genetics department is part of the EURAT group, and he was also the most restrictive in telling and explaining or informing patients, or just writing them a letter. This and that are your genetic mutations, and say that there needs to be much more sophisticated explanation, and there needs to be a counseling process before and after to deal with the information. But others say, well, that's their professional deformation. Just put it on the internet and learn. If you're curious, you can learn about your genome. So I don't have a final answer to that. There's one question in the back. Yeah.
Just a better procedure. But I wonder, I mean, the informed consent procedure had a certain meaning and sense if it actually helps people, patients, reach a decision that is more authentically theirs. But it's not clear to me that when there's or research subjects are presented with a certain world of big data that is completely foreign. Even people who deal with it try to understand what this world is. You cited a paper from Science from only a few years ago that said that what seems to be anonymous can actually be re-identified. So even the professionals don't really understand this world. And then one wonders, what really is the value of informed consent? Doesn't it really reduce to something that is more legal? You know, I have to say that he consented legally, but ethically speaking, seriously, I mean, does it really offer an answer that is valuable, or do people, once people are presented with some choices, and they choose something, but maybe just picking and not real thing, and so I'm not sure what the conclusion should be really, but I wonder how you think about it, about like informed consent in a question that refers to a world that the patient doesn't really understand. Perhaps we could just like tell them on a scale between 1 and 10,
I understand, yeah. Yeah. Well, of course, I think that's the case, that informed consent in a really informed way is kind of an ideal, and we are not even close, even in very simple situations, whether it's a surgical procedure or standard chemotherapy, or in phase 3 trial, most patients have the misconception, or phase 1/2 trial have the misconception that this is treatment and not an experiment in a way, and that their chances for benefiting is much higher than it's the average benefit that you have in phase 1/2 trial. So that is known for 20 years now. But it's also known for 20 years that our informed consent documents and information process is just made to back up the legal part and not written in a way so that patient can understand it. Most patients with a 9th grader level don't understand what we write there. It's academics writing for academics. So I think it's neither nor. It's not only because it's not that easy that we should give up the ideal. And there are consent trials that worked with easier language, and that is what we tried with our focus group. We went with the patients through the issues that so the incidental findings, the de-identification is. So it's not that difficult to explain what is at stake, and that is at least a risk. And then there was a very vivid discussion, and patients came up on different sides in the group. So it's not impossible to explain the issue in clear language and then leave it to the patient to make a decision. But the interesting part is, what I observed is that the patients make a very good calculation of kind of, yes, there is a risk, but there's also a risk if I pay with my credit card with the data, and this risk or if I use my Facebook account. So they calculate the risk and more or less say, well, but this is now a valuable goal and I take the risk. And some say, no, I don't do that, but it would be important to inform them in the first place. And it seems to be that it's more the information material, but also the process of informing, kind of to have more points in time where you can come back and ask questions that is important, or to have a study nurse and not a busy doctor to explain it. And this is what we are working on. So we have now, next step would be to have a randomized trial with material and little explanatory videos versus standard informed consent procedure, and see whether that makes any delta, whether patients are better informed. But on the other hand, I think if we just invest a little bit of the money that we invest in the research, also in how to better inform patients, I think it's just a field that has been quite neglected. It's always there, participatory in the P4 medicine, but in the end, that is the part that has no funding whatsoever.